And welcome to Trenton 365, everyone. Jacque Howard here, the founder and creator. And we want to say, be sure that you grab yourself a writing utensil and a piece of paper. This is a very interesting and informative time that we're going to be chatting today. In just a moment, I'm going to be bringing on Carlos Moreno. And Carlos is an author, but he's also deeply involved in Greenwood. And the website is the Victory of Greenwood. And with that being said, folks, many of you have heard of Black Wall Street, et cetera. We're going to be talking a bit about some of those social justice things that have happened throughout the country, but we're going to be speaking specifically about Greenwood in just a moment. But again, folks, it's mostly important that you grab yourself a writing utensil and a piece of paper, because the information that the Trenton 365 show is bringing you is an encouragement for you to be a part of developing the community that you specifically want, for you to be civically engaged, for you to know who your politicians are, for you to know who the nonprofits and for-profit businesses and the leaders are in your community, because that is how we can have a better understanding and overstanding about what this looks like as far as economic scale. And now it is my pleasure to bring on Carlos Moreno, and Carlos is going to be coming on, and Carlos and I literally met via video just a couple of weeks ago as I was doing some research. And big shout out to Meg Sutherland also on his team, who were a big help. We had a great conversation. We just got this ball rolling. And just like many of the other guests that I bring on, you're going to expect to hear more about the Victory of Greenwood and Carlos Moreno and the nonprofit organization going forward. This is not a one-shot deal. Carlos, finally glad to sit down in a recorded setting and to get some of this information out, sir. I'd like for you to get started, first of all, and just introduce yourself, share a little bit about some of the passions you have, and then let's get right into talking about Greenwood.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks for having me on. I'm definitely glad to be here from Tulsa, Oklahoma, all the way out to Jersey. So that's great. And so the Victory of Greenwood is the name of the book. It's we just sent it off to press about a week ago. So I'm super excited. I'm especially excited for the rest of the country to be able to read the research that we put into this book. I learned about Greenwood as a freelance graphic designer working for the Oklahoma Eagle, which is the successor to an older newspaper in Tulsa called the Tulsa Star. The Tulsa Star is it's the oldest daily Black newspaper in the country, and it was founded by a gentleman by the name of A.J. Smitherman, who actually went on to move to Buffalo, New York, and became one of the most prominent African-American journalists of his time. He owned the newspaper, the Buffalo Empire Star, all the way up until 1961. So up until not that long ago, really. And that's what I continue to find throughout this book, is that the people of Greenwood really had influence throughout the country, far beyond the massacre. We hear about the massacre on television, on these HBO shows like Lovecraft Country and The Watchmen. What we don't hear about is the history of the people of Greenwood and their stories and their accomplishments throughout history and how they influence history. So that's really what I wanted people to get a sense of in this book, is that the history of Greenwood, of this neighborhood, doesn't end with the massacre in 1921. It continues on. The neighborhood continued on, it rebuilt, and the people continued on. They rebuilt their lives, they rebuilt their homes, their businesses, and many of them went on and became quite successful and quite influential throughout history.
During some of my research and our conversations, you alerted me to something that, when people hear Tulsa, Oklahoma, they only hear of the city. They don't realize the different neighborhoods, the different pockets of the community. Can you just explain Greenwood, and in particular Greenwood in relation to Tulsa as a whole?
Sure. Yeah. Yeah, and that's definitely an important thing to keep in mind. We see Greenwood in these television shows or or we see pictures of Greenwood, and all we think about is this sort of few blocks of businesses. But Greenwood was actually a very thriving neighborhood, a quite large neighborhood. It encompassed 40 blocks. And it lies to the north of the downtown area in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And it was intentionally built along the railroad tracks. It was founded in 1905. And it was built along the railroad tracks because that was the center of commerce. You could think about the railroad in the late 1890s, early 1900s as kind of the internet of today. You know, if you weren't on the railroad, you had a disadvantage when it came to business, when it came to commerce. And you know, the opposite was also true. If you were on the railroad, if you had your businesses, your centers of commerce along the railroad, you were very successful. And Greenwood was one of these communities. And it was primarily Black owned. After the Civil War ended, well, this started actually around the 1830s. Native American tribes were moved out of their native lands to Indian territory. And Indian territory is the eastern half of Oklahoma. And here we're talking about the Choctaw, the Chickasaw, the Seminole, the Creek, and the Cherokee nations, the 5 civilized tribes. They were all relocated away from their ancestral lands to Indian territory. And they brought with them, many of the tribes sided with the Confederacy during the Civil War. They brought with them their slaves. Many of the slaves were Black. And this is an issue that is even being fought still to this day. The rights of the Black slaves of native tribes, and that having their citizenry in the tribe being recognized. So these Black freedmen arrive in Oklahoma, and many of them, because of the Indian Allotment Acts, you may have heard of the Dawes Act. Because of these Indian Allotment Acts, they had land assigned to them. So they were able to build on their land, develop their land, and in 1901, oil was discovered. So many of them had oil on their land, you know, and were able to build wealth because of the oil that was on their land. By the time you get to 1905, when Greenwood is established, there were 50 all-Black towns in the state of Oklahoma. Well, it wasn't the state yet, but it was still a territory. But you had 50 all-Black towns, which is more than any other place in the country. And so Greenwood was one of these communities. It wasn't a city unto itself, but it was part of the city of Tulsa, and an all-Black community in a place where there were many, many, many all-Black communities. It was really a time when Black Americans had quite a bit of, well, they had land, certainly, but they had quite a bit of autonomy. They had quite a bit of clout, you know, in a place and in a time when, you know, that would be taken away from them when Oklahoma becomes a state. And when these other states, after the Civil War, rewrite their constitutions, when they rewrite their constitutions, that's where you get all of these Jim Crow laws that develop, is from these constitutions that were rewritten after the Civil War.
You know, Carlos, I want you to go off into the weeds just briefly to talk about that. Then we're going to bring it back. But I had a conversation just recently with a friend about how this idea of the structure of our culture, how it's wrapped in this certain type of ideology, and unless we address that ideology and unwrap it, or at least discuss it, we're going to continually have these things that resurface when people find out, oh, this was because of that, or this action was because of that. Can you just speak to that a little bit and I'd like you to go into it as deep as you want about how we've got, this is a structure. This isn't just, okay, we're going to have a change of mind and a change of thinking right now.
Yeah. Well, yeah. You know, you have this sort of very influential, powerful Black neighborhood um, in Greenwood. I mean, the Stratford Hotel in Greenwood, Oklahoma, was Greenwood, Tulsa, was the most expensive, most luxurious Black-owned hotel at the time. The Tulsa Star, as I mentioned before, was the first Black daily newspaper. So here's a community that's really breaking a lot of ground and making a lot of progress for the Black community, not just in Oklahoma, but throughout the country. And thrived well up until 1921. And then, of course, you have what is known as the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre. And people have this, Dick Rowland and Sarah Page in the elevator story. Rachel Maddow, talked about it on Monday night, and really that story is quite a bit of a smokescreen. It was not the reason for the massacre itself. And if you think about it for a second, a man stepping on a woman's toe, and that results in the destruction of 40 blocks of a neighborhood. I mean, that just doesn't make any sense. It just doesn't. What you had in reality was a power structure in Tulsa that was composed of business owners, the local government, the local police. They were all involved in coordinating this destruction of Greenwood in order to steal Greenwood's land. And this isn't just, Carlos putting on his tinfoil hat and coming up with a weird conspiracy theory. We've backed this up with primary documents, with newspaper articles at the time written by Black journalists, with court case files that were filed at the time, and with real journalism that was being done at the time, that was uncovering what the reasons for the attack on Greenwood really were. There was a newspaper article from December of 1921. So this is just several months, after this attack on Greenwood happened, where attorney Elisha Scott, who's from Topeka, Kansas, extracts a confession from police officers in Tulsa that says, yes, the attack on Greenwood was planned and the police department was a part of it. So again, all of this is documented. And if people went and looked at the primary sources, at the documents, at the newspaper articles, the court case files, the land records and things like that we've researched, which is all in the book. If you go to the back of the book and you look at the sources, you can see all my sources where I pulled all this information. We really went deep, and we wanted to research this event for what it was, but also talk about not just the destruction and the tragedy of Greenwood, but how Greenwood was able to recover, and sort of the mechanics of that, and how is it that this community was able to revive and recover. They had land wealth, as I mentioned before. A lot of Greenwood's wealth came from outside of Tulsa. Greenwood was kind of a place where you would come and spend your money. There were hat shops and clothing shops and grocery stores and movie theaters and soda fountains, and those kinds of things. So Greenwood was a place where you would come and spend your money, but you made your wealth outside of Greenwood. By and large, most of the most wealthy sort of founders or wealthy leaders of Greenwood, they dealt in land. They traded, bought and sold land. They bought and sold mineral rights. They bought and sold oil rights, and that is how they built their wealth. So
I want to interrupt you there, Carlos, because I think that you nailed it earlier, talking about how in subsequent in previous conversations we talked about this as well, about how this kind of like whitewash or white savior kind of mentality is now here, like, oh, we're going to do what we can for Greenwood. And you had nailed that there's organizations and entities now who see this as an opportunity to level up what they're doing, but not necessarily doing it in a way that's really doing justice to the people of Greenwood and to Tulsa as well. Can you just talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I think so. If you think about, HBO, The Watchmen, the Lovecraft Country shows, as I mentioned, all you see is the tragedy of Greenwood, and so in a sense, it's almost as if, there's a profit off of showing this tragedy and this misery, right? And I think that goes for a lot of projects that are happening right now, books and documentaries that are being produced, that only talk about the massacre and only talk about this sort of Dick Rowland and Sarah Page narrative, that has somehow, gotten to be the only story of,
Mm.
why this event happened. um and it is kind of a simple story. You see Dick Rowland and Sarah Page in an elevator, and you see, the destruction of Greenwood, and that's sort of a simple story to tell, right? But it's inaccurate. It's not the way that this event happened. There were many, as you mentioned earlier, structural and systemic reasons why this event happened. There was a motive behind it, which was to steal Greenwood's land. And those are conversations, and the fact again that Greenwood rebuilt is not a part of the story. And so to have this incomplete narrative and this incorrect narrative, um, really paints a wrong picture of Greenwood, and not a picture of Greenwood as it was taught to me by the elders that I learned from when I worked in Greenwood 20 years ago. So I really think it does an injustice if you don't tell the full story, and if you don't really get into the facts of what was going on at the time. What were the politics at the time? What were the motives at the time for this attack? And people are really kind of almost in a way profiting off of misery or profiting off of tragedy. And I can understand in the Hollywood world, that those kind of things sell, so to speak. But it's not truth telling, right? And it's not bringing anything. You're not bringing any solutions to the table if you're just telling that narrative. You know, if you don't talk about the fact that Lulu Williams, one of the most famous pictures and one of the most famous images, and this even appeared in The Watchmen, was the Williams Dreamland Theater. And you see this great theater, but then you see like it burning down, and the marquee, falls. It says Williams, kind of in these lights. And if you've seen the show, you've seen it, or if you've seen any pictures of Greenwood, and the massacre, you've probably seen this photograph. But what people don't realize is that Lulu Williams, this this Black woman entrepreneur who was a leader of her community, rebuilt back her theater. There's a newspaper article from September 14th of 1922 in the Black Dispatch from Oklahoma City announcing the reopening of the Williams Dreamland Theater. So why aren't we telling that story? And my book, and I intentionally called it The Victory of Greenwood, is we're not telling the stories of the victories of these people who came from Greenwood. And I'm not talking about just in 1921, although there were certainly a number of victories then. But Greenwood went on to become a thriving community well into the late 1960s. And there were people in Greenwood who were heavily involved in the civil rights movement as early as 1958. There were people who were heavily involved in the evolution, and the growing of Black churches. there was Emmett J. McHenry, who in the 80s and 90s was a pioneer in the technology industry. He grew up on Greenwood, graduated Booker T. Washington High School here in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and went on and founded Network Solutions, which in the early 90s, if you were buying a domain name, that was the only company you could buy it from. So for a number of years, he had the exclusive rights. Not only did he found this great company, Network Solutions, but he was the one who developed the technology for networked computers on the internet to speak with each other, to communicate with each other. So here's a pioneer in the technology world who should have his name right next to Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak and Tim Berners-Lee and Nolan Bushnell, but like Emmett J. McHenry should be right on that list, but he isn't. And my question is why? Why do we not talk about Emmett J. McHenry? Why do we not talk about people like Otis Clark, people like Olivia Hooker, who were, Amos T. Hall, worked with Thurgood Marshall and desegregated colleges in Oklahoma. And this, again, was in the late 1950s, like very early on in the civil rights movement. You have these great pioneers who are all from this place. And we don't talk about them. We don't talk about them in Tulsa. And we don't talk about them anywhere else either.
Carlos Moreno, author, activist, we're speaking about the victory of Greenwood. Carlos, before we finish up, I do want you to touch on something, but I wanted to make a comment about how you're focusing on the successes of Greenwood. Because I think oftentimes as people of color, in particular African Americans, we have this tendency to only look at some of the most horrific things, but not see what has been birthed out of those and the successes in things where we are now. I want to say thank you for focusing on that, and consider Trenton 365 a partner with getting as much information out as possible. I want you to talk about where Greenwood is today and in the social justice movement, and what some people can expect from our other forthcoming conversations about some of the things that you're going to be sharing with them and how they can get involved in this.
Yeah, it's a mix, right? There is a lot of tragedy. What ended up happening to Greenwood, I mentioned it was a thriving community. Well, up into the late 1960s, what happened in the late 1960s was the beginning of the federal highway program. Something that, on the East Coast, many communities are familiar with, especially Black and immigrant communities are familiar with. I was familiar with on the West Coast because my dad grew up in a neighborhood in San Jose, California, which was mostly a Mexican immigrant neighborhood. And a highway was built through it. And you see this pattern, again, talking about the structural, injustices that happen. The federal highway program was probably one of the most damaging programs to Black neighborhoods and minority neighborhoods in this entire country. It happened in more than 60 cities all over the nation. And what's left of Greenwood today is a reflection of that. It's only kind of a block and a half of this small business district as part of downtown. That's kind of the only things that's left of this 40 block thriving neighborhood. And so in one sense, that is a tragedy that's all that's left today. But in another sense, what you have is in Greenwood and you really have to kind of look beneath the surface, but there is a community of Black entrepreneurs. And I'll give you just one example. And I think this is a great story. The leader of the attack on Greenwood was also the leader of the Ku Klux Klan at the time. His name was Tate Brady. So Brady owned a mansion that was on the other side of downtown. So Greenwood is on the eastern side of downtown. and Brady and his neighborhood was kind of on the western side of downtown. Well, there was a former NFL player by the name is Felix Jones. He played for the Dallas Cowboys. He bought Tate Brady's mansion and he turned it into an artist collective studio for musicians, for painters, for creative people, black, mostly black artists and musicians. Well, their album just got signed by Motown about 2 weeks ago. Their artists are now being featured in some of the most prominent galleries in Tulsa. So you have this real turnaround. And again, yes, there is tragedy. Yes, there are injustices that are happening in Greenwood right now. There are still, there's still gentrification. There's still housing issues. There's still poverty issues. But on the flip side of that, you have this very interesting community of Black entrepreneurs who are really working hard to flip the script and, produce their own successes. And really build a community for themselves. And to me, that's incredibly encouraging. If we had several more of those, you could build this critical mass and have a lot of success in the Black community in Tulsa, I believe.
Carlos Moreno, author, activist, book is The Victory of Greenwood. I know we're short on time, but that is why I always like to lock people in saying, now you're coming back again. You're going to be spending some time with Jacque and Trenton 365, and I can't wait to have you back. But I want to tell you that you and Meg, I'm really excited. I'm looking forward to sharing information, growing in relationship. And as things continue to open up for me to bring our crew down to Tulsa, to Greenwood, and document that our way in conjunction with you, and make sure that stories like this, and not even stories, history like this, doesn't get washed away, doesn't get whitewashed, doesn't get put off to the side, doesn't become an economic engine for some corporation that has no interest in supporting the locals, because that's all that Civic Engagement Radio is about. We have got to realize that we, the people, have got to build the community that we want. So Carlos, I thank you so much, and I'll be in touch as far as the next time that you're going to come back. I want you to come back in less than a month in May, because I know that more and more people are going to get excited about this. And once the book is released, I want to make sure that we can set some things up for you and get you out here on the East Coast. Okay.
Yeah. The centennial of this attack is coming up. And I think, again, very tragic event, of course, and something that we need to honor and be respectful of, but also, focusing on that, the victories as well, right? So we're on Twitter, Greenwood 1922. We're on the web, thevictoryofgreenwood.com, as you mentioned. We're on Facebook, we're on Instagram, so you can reach us on all the social media channels, and I can't wait to be back. I know we'll have a lot of really great conversations.
Fantastic. Carlos Moreno, thank you so much, sir. Author of The Victory of Greenwood. Thank you so much for your time. Folks, you've been listening and watching the Trenton 365 show. And as I start the program, I always encourage you to get a writing utensil and a piece of paper. Sometimes that incites another kind of energy in you, where you can chat with people like Carlos Moreno and what he's doing in Tulsa, Oklahoma, in Greenwood. And he's boots on the ground, hands in the soil. He's not someone who just dropped in, parachuted in, grabbed some information from the local library, and now is distributing this information, trying to make some cash. No, he's thinking about economic development. Just ran off. I can't even keep up with the list of people that he's run off. So I know that there's plenty of information for you to look up and for you to get excited about it. And if you're a person of color, if you're an immigrant, if you're just someone who believes in social justice, you have to advise yourself and be more aware about some of these ills that have taken place in our country and how we hold our elected officials accountable today so that things like this never happen again. Jacque Howard here, founder and the host of Trenton 365, reminding you that it's always about justice, peace, and humility.